I still remember exactly how it felt, walking into that office just a few weeks out from my final round of chemo. My hair hadn't fully grown back yet, and my energy came in waves, but I showed up anyway, earlier than my doctor had advised. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I just didn't want to be seen as fragile or replaceable. I'd been with Wendell Stratton Consulting for nearly 13 years, ever since I left the military and started rebuilding my life from scratch. I helped design their operational backbone back when we were still juggling spreadsheets manually. And maybe it was naive, but I honestly believed loyalty, consistency, and grit would count for something. But that morning, when they called me into the glass panel boardroom overlooking the Missouri River, same one I used to dream of leading meetings in, I saw it in his eyes before he even opened his mouth. Not regret, not compassion, just that cold, detached look of a man who'd already made his decision. "Calvin," he said, his voice steady, like he was reading a weather report. "We've decided to move in a younger direction for our leadership team. I'm sure you understand. After everything you've been through with your health, the team needs fresh energy." I nodded, slowly, but something inside me cracked. Not because of the words, but because of what they meant. My years of spotless performance, my nights spent troubleshooting systems while hooked up to IV drips, the projects I salvaged, the margins I rescued, none of it mattered. I wasn't being let go for making mistakes. I was being pushed out because I no longer fit their image. They didn't fire me for failing. They discarded me because I was no longer easy to market. I walked out of that meeting without anger or tears, just a deep, hollow stillness. And then, beneath that silence, something began to take shape. Not hatred, not vengeance, a plan. When I first joined Wendell Stratton Consulting, I was 52, graying at the temples and carrying 2 decades of experience that didn't quite fit into their sleek startup culture. I had just retired from the military logistics corps, and while some saw that as an odd background for a data operations firm, I saw it as an asset: discipline, structure, precision. At the time, they were a small firm trying to find their footing in the Denver corporate scene, and I brought the kind of systems thinking that turned chaos into flow. I didn't need flash. I built foundations. For the first few years, I stayed late when no one asked me to, patched together back-end infrastructure that had been duct taped with outdated tools, and rewrote entire segments of code when vendors couldn't deliver. I mentored younger analysts who, at the time, didn't know the difference between a bottleneck and a black swan, and I did it without ever asking for credit. That wasn't my way. I didn't speak in buzzwords. I didn't charm my way into boardrooms, and I sure as hell didn't play politics over coffee breaks. What I did was solve problems. I kept projects on track. I stabilized client portfolios during turbulent quarters, and I was the guy they turned to when the margins were slipping and the CEO was breathing down someone's neck. It was never glamorous work, and it rarely made the quarterly newsletter, but it was essential, and I believed that, in the end, results would matter more than appearances. When the cancer diagnosis came 3 years ago, it didn't knock me down the way people expect. If anything, it just sharpened my focus. I went from scan to strategy session, from chemo chair to client calls, carrying a laptop in my glove compartment and running simulations during infusion cycles. My oncologist once asked if I'd ever considered slowing down. I just laughed. I couldn't afford to. Not because of money, though the bills piled up, but because in this line of work, out of sight meant out of mind, and I knew what happened to people my age who took too long to recover. They came back to a younger version of themselves sitting at their desk. Even through the worst of it, when my hands shook from the side effects and I had to wear gloves just to type, I never missed a deadline. I never let my team down. I automated our reporting system to reduce their workload, restructured our internal data flow to cut processing time by 40%, and closed deals that added 6 figures to our bottom lineal while taking calls in a hospital gown, pretending the beeping in the background was just a smoke alarm. And they knew what I was doing, how much I was carrying, how much I was giving, yet they never once asked if I needed support. Not once did they offer help or even acknowledge the fight I was waging behind the scenes. They were grateful when the numbers looked good, but they didn't ask how those numbers got there. To them, I was reliable, almost invisible, a machine that kept running, no matter what. But I saw the shift long before the boardroom meeting. New hires came in with shinier resumes and louder voices, and slowly, I stopped being invited to brainstorms. My ideas and welcomed were now too old school. They didn't want expertise anymore. They wanted youth, polish, charm. What I brought, the quiet, consistent results, wasn't sexy. And in their eyes, it wasn't enough. So when they sat me down and framed their decision as necessary for the company's growth, it wasn't just a blow, it was confirmation of something I'd feared for months. That all the years I'd spent holding the scaffolding together didn't matter. That a man who had built the system from scratch could be pushed aside simply because his health faltered and his hair had gone silver. Still, I didn't fight it, not then. Because while they were busy looking for the next fresh face to lead, I had already started building something of my own. Quietly, relentlessly, and unlike them, I wasn't focused on impressions. I was building impact. I didn't argue, I didn't plead, or raise my voice. I simply looked at Douglas Grant, me supervisor of 7 years, and gave him the one thing he never expected: peace. The kind of unnerving, measured peace that only comes when you've already made your choice long before they thought to take something from you. He expected resistance. He was prepared for outrage. What he wasn't prepared for was acceptance. As he slid the exit paperwork across the table, probably assuming I'd need time to process or reflect, I reached into my leather folder and placed an envelope on the desk, steady and deliberate, like a closing statement in a trial I didn't agree to be a part of. His hand paused mid-gesture. "What's this?" he asked, his tone now uncertain, his gaze flickering between the envelope and my face. I met his eyes not with defiance, but with clarity. "My resignation," I said calmly. "Effective in 2 weeks." He leaned back, shifting in his chair as if the floor beneath him had tilted. For a moment, the room was silent, save for the faint hum of the building's HVAC and the creak of his leather chair. I could see the surprise morphing into discomfort, his confidence unraveling at the edges. "Calvin, wait, let's not rush into anything. I think we can find a role that better suits your current situation." I almost laughed, but instead I offered a polite nod. "You were right, Doug," I said. "The company needs a new direction, and so do I." What Doug didn't know, and what no one at Wendell Stratton had bothered to ask during the months I was fading into the background, was that I hadn't been idle. While they were busy sizing up fresh recruits and hosting Friday cocktail brainstorms, I was quietly building something that didn't need a board's approval or a manager's permission to matter. For the past 18 months, in the quiet hours before sunrise and long after the office lights had gone dark, I had been designing a new operational framework cone that streamlined workflows, reduced redundancy, and applied real-time analytics in a way no current system in the firm could match. At first, it had been my own way of coping, a way to channel the helplessness I felt while fighting cancer into something I could control. But as it evolved, so did its potential. No one in the company knew that I had filed for a patent 6 months ago. No one knew that I'd already tested the system with a small business network and received offers to license it. They had assumed, perhaps like so many others, that illness had diminished me, that age had dulled my ambition, that quiet meant defeat. But they never understood that the quietest person in the room is often the one doing the most dangerous thinking. I walked out of that office, not as a discarded employee, but as a man who had outgrown the room without ever needing to raise his voice. And as I returned to my desk while the rest of the team whispered and side-eyed their way through the open plan floor, I didn't pack my things. Not yet. I still had 2 weeks. 2 weeks to leave my final imprint, not with confrontation, but with closure. I copied the files I'd authored, reports that had shaped quarterly turnarounds, forecasts that saved clients millions, algorithms that had shaved days off our workflow cycle sand. I did it not to sabotage, but to preserve the evidence of what I had actually done, so that when things eventually crumbled, no one could say it was just luck or coincidence that held the place together. I wasn't stealing. I wasn't hiding. I was documenting my legacy before it could be rewritten by people who never truly saw me. There was something oddly poetic in knowing I'd become invisible to them, because invisibility in the right hands becomes power. And while they celebrated my replacement, a man half my age who wore his charm like a cologne and his title like a costume, I stayed silent. I didn't expose anything. I didn't warn them. I simply waited. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't public. It isn't loud. It's patient, composed, and devastating in its timing. By the second week of my notice period, the office had settled into a strange rhythm, like a boat adjusting to the absence of a weight it hadn't realized was holding it steady. People moved a little more confidently around my desk, conversations shifted into past tense when I passed by, and the new department lead, Bradley, fresh from a tech accelerator in Austinhod, started practicing the swagger of leadership without yet earning the substance behind it. He came over one morning, leaning on the edge of my desk like it was already his. "Hey, Calvin," he said, too casually for someone who had once shadowed me in meetings he barely understood. "I hope you're not taking it personally. I mean, I get it. This whole transition's tough, right? Especially when you've been somewhere a long time." He smiled, polished and hollow. I paused, finished my line of code, and closed the system dashboard I had spent 5 years building from the ground up. "Not at all," I said, my voice even. "I'm sure you'll do great." He took that as surrender. But what he didn't know, what no one in that building knew, was that the numbers everyone applauded me for, the seamless project turnarounds, the rising client satisfaction scores, and the record-setting cost reductions weren't the result of standard procedures or the firm's outdated templates. They came from a framework I had personally built, refined, and tested outside company hours, long before anyone even thought to ask how we were getting so fast, so lean, so consistent. What started as a coping mechanism during chemo, something to keep my mind sharp while my body waged war against itself, had evolved into a robust, AI-integrated project optimization system unlike anything Wendell Stratton Consulting had ever licensed or developed. It wasn't flashy, but it worked. And more importantly, it was mine. I'd filed for the patent 6 months earlier under my name, independent of the firm, after legal review confirmed it didn't violate any IP clauses in my employment contract. They never thought to look because they never imagined someone like me, quiet, aging, recovering, could be ahead of them. That was their first mistake. In the second page of my resignation envelope, I had included a summary report detailed, technical, impossible to misinterpret. It listed the financial impact of my system over 3 fiscal years, the projected client retention value, the metrics improvement, and most importantly, the patent ID, already approved and registered in my personal name. I didn't spell it out. I didn't need to. I simply documented what was true and let the silence do the rest. 3 days later, I received an email from a man I hadn't spoken to in over a decade. Leonard Mayfield, CEO of Northbridge Dynamics, one of the top competitors in our sector. He'd heard through the grapevine that I was stepping away and wanted to grab coffee. That coffee turned into a strategy meeting. The strategy meeting turned into an offer. But not just a job, not just a title. He offered partnership, equity, full creative control. "We've been watching your results for years," he said, sliding a folder across the table. "We assumed the firm had some kind of proprietary edge. Turns out, it was just you." I didn't accept on the spot. I didn't have to. The decision had already been made the moment Wendell Stratton looked past me in favor of someone who knew how to network but couldn't even generate a clean quarterly report. I walked out of that coffee shop with the kind of calm that only comes when the truth is finally starting to work in your favor. And when I returned to the office to finish out my notice, I didn't gloat. I didn't shift the atmosphere. I just kept my head down and watched. Watched as the system began to slow without my fine-tuned oversight. Watched as deadlines started slipping by hours, then days. Watched as Bradley struggled to answer questions I'd once handled in my sleep. And all the while, I waited. Not to celebrate, but to make sure everything was in place. Because the thing about building something from nothing is, every corner of it, what holds it up, what makes it run, and what happens when you're no longer there to fix the fractures before they spread. And Wendell Stratton, they were about to find out just how fragile their success had really been. It didn't take long. Barely 6 weeks had passed since I turned in my badge and walked out of Wendell Stratton Consulting for the last time, yet the cracks that had once been barely visible were now gaping wounds. I had started my new role at Northbridge Dynamics with the quiet satisfaction of a man who no longer needed to explain his worth. My office overlooked the city's skyline, my name etched into frosted glass beside the words, Director of Systems Innovation. But what truly made me pause each morning was the feeling not of victory, but of being seen. I was halfway through finalizing our national rollout strategy when I got the first call. It was a former colleague of the few who had treated me with decency, in the end speaking in hushed tones like he was confessing something shameful. "You should check the trade wires, Calvin," he said, his voice low. "Things are falling apart over here." I thanked him without asking for more, already opening my browser with the kind of calm you only get from knowing exactly how a storm was seeded. The headlines were blunt and unforgiving. Wendell Stratton reports Q2 collapse, 30% client loss, operational delays, major contracts terminated. I scrolled through the article, each paragraph a brutal dissection of what had once been my domain. Projects stalled in early phases, client accounts suspended due to missed deadlines, internal systems now described as fragmented, inefficient, and mysteriously downgraded in capability. And there it was, buried halfway through the report, a quote from a long-term client who had once called me personally to thank me for saving his division. Since Calvin Fletcher left, the reliability just vanished. It's like the backbone is gone. I leaned back in my chair as a wave of quiet vindication washed over Minot's smugness. Not even triumph, but something deeper and more profound. Validation. They hadn't just lost a system. They'd lost the understanding of how it worked, the discipline behind its design, and the willingness to respect the person who had kept it running all those years. They thought they could replace experience with enthusiasm, silence with charisma, and depth with appearance. But now, they were realizing what I had known all along, that the engine doesn't care how loud the driver talks. It only moves if someone knows how to turn the gears. The second message came later that afternoon, a text from the same colleague. "Bradley's having a breakdown in the break room. He just got cornered over another missed delivery date." I closed my laptop gently, letting the information settle like dust on a shelf I no longer needed to clean. I didn't laugh, I didn't gloat, I just exhaled. Because this wasn't about watching them flee, it was about proving, in the most undeniable way possible, that I had never needed them to rise. I had heard rumors they were scrambling, trying to reverse engineer the system I left behind, hiring consultants to trace the architecture, even reaching out to former interns who had seen parts of it in use. But what they didn't understand, what they still refused to grasp, was that it wasn't just a tool. It was a philosophy, a discipline built over decades of service, forged through illness, age, and the quiet refusal to become obsolete. And that kind of thinking can't be copied from a dashboard or downloaded from a file server. Back at Northbridge, my system was already being piloted across 3 departments, and the results were so promising that Leonard had quietly fast-tracked plans to deploy it company-wide. Efficiency metrics were soaring, and clients were requesting meetings just to ask how we'd managed to cut delivery times by nearly half. For the first time in years, I wasn't invisible. I was the blueprint. And then, on a Thursday morning, thick with the scent of autumn, Leonard walked into my office with a newspaper folded under his arm and that wry smile he wore when something significant had just happened. He dropped the paper on my desk. The headline stretched across the top. "Wendell Stratton announces major restructure after talent exodus and platform failure." I read it slowly, letting every word settle like a chapter I never planned to write, but somehow always knew I would. Leonard nodded toward the article, his tone even. "They tried to rebuild it," he said, "but they never understood the mind that created it. They thought they were buying parts when what they needed was vision." I didn't say anything right away. I just looked at the window, out toward the city I had once thought I might retire quietly in, and I thought about every night I had stared at my hospital ceiling wondering if I would still matter by the time the treatments ended. I thought about the mornings when my hands trembled too much to hold a coffee mug, yet I still made it to my desk before the rest of the office arrived. And then I thought about Doug Granth's voice, his eyes, his certainty that I had already given everything I had to give. They were wrong. I hadn't given my best years to Wendell Stratton. I had only given them the years I thought they deserved. The best came after they let me go. It was just past 7 a.m. when the message arrived tucked between calendar invites and project briefs, disguised in the same neutral font as every corporate email that had ever tried to mask emotion with professionalism. The subject line was short, "Apology," and the sender was Douglas Grant. I stared at it for a moment longer than necessary, not because I was uncertain about opening it, but because I already knew what it would say. And when I did finally click, the words unfolded exactly as I expected. "Calvin, I hope this message finds you well. I'm sure you've heard about what's happened here. I wanted to say I was wrong not seeing your value was the greatest failure of my leadership. The systems you created were our foundation. We didn't realize that until they collapsed without you. I submitted my resignation last week. Before I left, I made sure the board knew exactly where we failed. There was no anger in me, not anymore. The bitterness had drained away long before this message ever reached my inbox, replaced by something stronger, peace, clarity, and a sense of purpose that Wendell Stratton had never been able to offer, even in his best years. I reread the email only once, not because it changed anything, but because I wanted to honor the closure it attempted to bring. Bradley, as I'd later learn, had also stepped down quietly, discreetly, under the guise of a mutual separation. It turned out that charisma could only carry you so far when you were asked to actually deliver. The reports fell apart, the systems buckled, and the clients walked, not because of one man's absence, but because the firm had spent too long ignoring the value of consistency, competence, and quiet leadership. But by then, I was no longer looking back. At Northbridge, the system I built wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. Our efficiency numbers had broken records, not because of some shiny rollout campaign, but because people actually believed in the process. The new team respected the work, asked thoughtful questions, and didn't just implement, they improved. The culture wasn't built on appearances, but on purpose. A few months after Douglas's message, Leonard called me into his office again. He didn't make a speech. He simply handed me a letter, already signed by the board, and told me the promotion was unanimous. Executive Vice President of Strategy and Innovation. Not because I had demanded it or maneuvered for it, but because the impact had made itself impossible to ignore. I was, at last, recognized not for being loud, but for being right. That evening, as I walked past my office glass walls glowing in the last light of the day, I noticed something pinned behind my chair. It was a framed copy of our latest quarterly report, annotated and read by Leonard himself. At the bottom, a single line written in his hand. Built by hands that never asked to be praised, only trusted. Later that week, I gathered the entire team for a kickoff meeting before our next product launch. As the room settled, I paused, looked around, and decided for the first time in a long time to share the story. Not about systems or software, not about collapse or redemption, but about value, what it looks like, how it's ignored, and why it should never be measured by volume. I was once told I was too focused on results. I began, letting the words settle before continuing, as if that were a flaw. But let me tell you something. Results are how we prove we care. Results are how we keep promises, how we protect people who put their trust in us. Never let anyone shame you for being thorough, for being prepared, or for refusing to fail. There were no cheers, no applause, just a room full of quiet nods and respectful silence, the kind that says, "We understand." That night, driving home past the old Wendell Stratton building, now bearing a for lease sign and darkened windows, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grateful. Grateful they hadn't seen me. Grateful they pushed me out. Grateful because they made space for me to build something better. Because sometimes the greatest gift this world can give you is rejection. It forces you to stop trying to fit into a place that was never meant to hold you. It teaches you that the people who overlook you don't define your worth, and that the systems that break you can also shape you. It reminds you that it's not too late to start again, not at 30, not at 50, not after illness, not after loss. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's success without bitterness. It's peace without apology. It's finally becoming everything they said you never could be, and realizing you never needed their permission in the first place. If you've ever been overlooked, undervalued, or told that your best days are behind you, I want you to know your story isn't over. In fact, it may just be beginning. Subscribe for more stories like this. Leave a comment and tell me, when did you finally reclaim your worth? Share this with someone who needs to be reminded. Rejection isn't the end. It's the start of something stronger.